Hi everyone, I'm your host, Arlen Schumer, and welcome to one of my pop culture presentations. Get ready to be both educated and entertained, what I call edutainment. And when you're done, please be sure to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. There is a picture of Michael Kaluta in his Upper West Side, New York City studio. Born in 1947 in Guatemala, but from U.S. parents. So that's what maybe gives Mike Kaluta the exotic name and even his exotic look. Here he is in his younger days, in his mid to late 20s, when after growing up in Virginia, he went to the Richmond Professional Institute, which is now called Virginia Commonwealth University. I imagine he studied art there, but when he came to New York to try to have a career in comics, he hooked up with these gentlemen. That would be Bernie Wrightson on the left, above Barry Smith from England, Bernie Wrightson from Baltimore, and that would be Jeffrey Jones on the right, and he was from Georgia. And together, if guys like Neil Adams and Jim Steranko were the Beatles and Rolling Stones of comic book art in the 1960s, these guys are like the British invasion that followed, or maybe more like the Southern invasion, the equivalent of Leonard Skinner and Allman Brothers Band. But together in the 70s, they actually all worked together in a place called the Studio in New York City's Chelsea district. And this is the oversized volume that was produced, I believe, in 1979. Super rare, collecting all of their works, because as you can see by the cover, they shared in common this love of a romantic fantasy, very detailed, very filigreed world in which the worlds of fantasy, science fiction, horror, and comics would all intersect. And of all of them, Michael Kaluta has maybe proven to have the most prolific career. He's considered one of the greatest fantasy artists of our time, also one of the greatest horror artists as well, and maybe of all, one of our greatest science fiction artists. And yet, for all of Michael Kaluta's acclaim, perhaps the number one line on his resume is what we're here to celebrate tonight, the 50th anniversary of the debut of his comic book version of The Shadow, with this issue appearing on newsstands July 12th, 1973. Not only is it one of Michael Kaluta's greatest illustrations, one of the greatest images of the shadow ever done in any medium, and man, I could stare at that face and I think I have for hours. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Shadow of Michael William Kaluta. And my name is Arlen Schumer. Welcome. This is, of course, part 2. I did part 1 last week on the exact 50th anniversary, January 12th. I did a coffee table art book about comic book art in the 1960s and how it reflected what was going on in that turbulent decade. Well, Kaluta, of course, is considered, I don't like the metal terms, I like just calling it the 1970s. But yes, it was last week we covered the contents of all 5 issues that Kaluta did between 1973 and 1974. Issue 2's painted cover. Issue 3 is the issue that his friend Bernie Wrightson inked, making it a one-off kind of mini masterpiece, really. Just both painted covers in a row with a line art in the foreground, so dimensional. Of course, Michael Kaluta did not draw issue 5. Here is his cover that never got past the black and white art stage. Issue 5 was, yes, it looked like this. Who is that artist? Yes, it's Frank Robbins. I did a whole Frank Robbins webinar. If you're interested, go to my YouTube channel. But to my eyes and many who love Kaluta's Shadow, Robbins was just all wrong for the character. I mean, those close-ups, yikes. I remember we wanted the Kaluta Shadow, and thank God, one issue later, we got him. I don't know if we knew at the time this would be Kaluta's last DC Comics issue, an interior drawn story. Kaluta's last issue, his 5th issue of the Shadow. Beginning with issue 7, we got back to Frank Robbins again. And he has his fans. There were people that dug this version of the Shadow. But like I said, for many of us, these close-ups made us cringe and made us long for the Kaluta Shadow, which we would get, but only on the cover. In 1975, as DC kept the Shadow title alive with different interior artists after Robbins. But this cover has an early sketch version that looked like this. And you can see where Kaluta was going with that layout. He later did this sketch of the man in the car, which you could see survived as the final art in the background. Now, this was May of 75. Comics are dated 3 months in advance to encourage retailers to keep them out longer. But a month later, DC Comics put out their first comic book version of a character that dates back, like the Shadow, to the 1930s, called the Avenger. There is a kind of phoned-in Joe Kubert cover. I love Joe. No offense, Joe. The paperbacks were put out, I think, starting in 1972, maybe, and then DC got the rights in 75. So that's why the next issue of the Shadow, dated July 75, had this Kaluta cover and his take on the character. Now, there it is in beautiful black and white. And back to color. It's a nice figure of the Shadow in which Kaluta uses a lot of black to keep the details of the Shadow's clothing more obscure than other times. So sometime in 75, Kaluta does this ink drawing of the Shadow and Batman forever entwined, as the Shadow is such an influence on Batman. But we love the Shadow with his guns. So Kaluta has one more cover here in the summer of 75, as you can see it in full. And we're blessed to have this sketch. And you can see in the rough sketch how much of the main thrust of the illustration is already there. And then Kaluta just refines it and brings it to beautiful finish. Now, there might be a reason why Kaluta came back in 75 just for 3 covers. I don't know. There's not that many interviews with Kaluta. I don't think a lot has been written up about his Shadow period, but I think it's because these paperback covers began to appear in early 75. And yes, that would be Jim Steranko, the great comic book artist, along with Neil Adams. They were the Beatles and Rolling Stones of the 60s in comic book art. But Steranko, of course, was a big Shadow fan. In fact, those of you who saw part 1 of this webinar remember this image that Steranko illustrated as a proposal to DC Comics that he should illustrate the Shadow in 1973 before they gave it to Mike Kaluta. I think the powers that be at DC didn't want to give Steranko editorial control. They wanted to keep it in-house, and Steranko wouldn't agree to that. But in 75, or maybe these appeared in late 74, I'm not sure exactly when, you can see how Steranko did his take on the classic pulp version of the shadow painted by the great George Rosen. And that classic shadow nose. Boy, yes, who knows? The shadows knows. You can see in this George Rosen original how Steranko would take these iconic shadow painted images and repaint them in his manner. Beautiful. And then kind of Steranko's take. And at the time when Kaluta had dropped out of doing the shadow, we who love the character by Kaluta and love Steranko, we accepted these as maybe the best version of the shadow after Kaluta's. But every now and then we would get a glimpse of a Kaluta, and even in its raw stage, there was still something that Kaluta's shadow had that nobody else's did. Yes, the cover of some obscure fanzine, circa 75. Same thing with this one. I mean, that puts the fan in fanzine, right? But the illustration by Kaluta is a miniature gem, as is this from 1976. Some nice detail in that face. And then you get this mini masterpiece, dated 1976, in pure black and white, chiaroscuro, with that great shadow type design and the kind of smoke and flames. Really just an ethereal, beautiful black and white masterpiece by Kaluta. But it looks like it might have been a study for the painting he would do around the same time that looked like this. You gotta love it, don't you? And there it is in Kaluta's studio. Portrait of the artist as a young man, born in 1947. This is 1976 or so, 29 years old. 47, yes. That image was turned into a poster circa 1976, 77. I had both of these in my dorm room at Rhode Island School of Design. Here's the second one, titled Margot Lane and Lamont Cranston and Margot Lane. Now, in the current apartment I live in, my bathroom, believe it or not, is decorated in a corner like this. Now, the painting on the left that I framed is made of this print. This is 1980, Marionettes it's called. This is not actually the best reproduction. It's the best I could find. But yeah, it's a beautiful piece. And then you go up, and that image was a beautiful large print lithograph. And you can see how Kaluta painted this version circa 1980. What's the date there? 1987. But 10 years earlier, circa, maybe 11, it was the background of that great painting. 1977, a gift to somebody named Don. There's Kaluta's nice brushwork on the shadow. 1980. Ah, you gotta love this one. Beautiful exterior. You are there. Always seems to get requests for, everybody loves the Batman shadow team up image. 1984, this one. 1986. Interesting double gun image there. Right around this time, we get this radical interpretation of the shadow, written and drawn by the great Howard Chaykin, one of Kaluta's peers. that really belongs kind of hovering around that studio arena there. But Chaykin wrote and drew his own comics. In fact, a couple years earlier in '83, he debuted his own character, American Flag, which was a very forward-thinking, futuristic, prescient book. If you've never read it, there's many collections of it. But his take on the Shadow was as radical as his American Flag was, as you can see in this cover. And Chaykin's sense of design, always a prominent feature of his artwork, you can see in this beautiful cover, is attempting to put his stamp on the legendary character. Now, we do have this sketch in a 1992 ad, but as you can see, the sketch is from 1987, right after you have the Chaykin Shadow. Now, this looks like it might have been a preliminary sketch for this black and white masterpiece, which would become the cover of a graphic novel, not by DC, but by Marvel, yet written by Denny O'Neil, who was Kaluta's writer partner on his Shadow stories. And while the cover is not inked by Russ Heath, the interiors are. Now, when this came out in 1988, I remember it reminded me of Kaluta's great painting, and yet was different. Now, if we go into the title page, you can see the credits there. And years later, Kaluta would add this little, that's some schnozola on the Shadow there. But what's more telling is this interior page of the graphic novel explaining the story, I guess. But what intrigues me, of course, is this spot illustration, which, if you look closely in this better reproduction, yes, that's Kaluta inked by Wrightson. Bernie Wrightson was supposed to ink this graphic novel, but either it was taken away from him or he pulled out. He was one of the top artists in demand in that time, or the powers that be didn't think he could make the deadline. Again, I'm unclear on the details, but suffice to say, we got Russ Heath. Now, if you don't know who Russ Heath is, here's a picture of the very handsome, dashing Russ Heath, circa the 1950s, when he was doing war comics at DC Comics. Later in the 60s, he developed a real, almost photographic style based on him using himself as photo reference for some of his war stories. But for many years in the 60s and 70s and 80s, he was drawing Sergeant Rock whenever Joe Kubert could not draw the character. And you can see his style was a very tight, very detailed ink style. Russ Heath is the guy that did those back cover ads for the Roman soldiers, if you look at that finely detailed work. This is one of his war comic panels for GI Combat. And if this looks familiar to you astute art lovers, yes, this is the panel that Roy Lichtenstein used for "Okay, Hot Shot, okay, I'm pouring." Voomp. Taken from this Russ Heath panel. Now, Heath's tight line inking, I was very suspect of when I looked at this graphic novel. Now, while the beauty of Kaluta's pencils are underneath Heath's tight inks, I just didn't think this was a good mixture. I thought Heath's inks were too tight for the Shadow. Now, many people might like a panel like this, and I'm sure Heath took his time and inked it the best way he could, but give me Kaluta Shadow. Give me Kaluta Shadow inked by Wrightson. I forget whether this is from the Wrightson issue or those are Kaluta's inks. But suffice to say, I liked the rawer Shadow. I did not cotton to the tightly inked Russ Heath version. And while Kaluta's pencils and layouts were still spot on, as you can see in this page, there was just something a little flat and a little dead about what Heath's inks did to Kaluta's pencils. I don't think it was helped by the coloring either, which I found very dull, very kind of normal, what's called local color, no stylization, very drab if you just look at the coloring alone. And again, maybe had Kaluta inked this and even colored it, it might have been better looking. I don't even have this in my collection. As much as I love Kaluta's Shadow, there's just something about the art that is off-putting to me. I think it's an oil and water combination. The story, Hitler's astrologer, good luck. But anyway, here, look at this South American ad for the graphic novel. And interesting that the Shadow is known worldwide, because the next piece of art Kaluta would do around the time of the graphic novel is this June 1988 issue of American Politics. And I like the painting there. I like the green background echoing in the green earth and the green highlights on the Shadow's pallid skin. Kaluta's next painting would be circa 88, 89 as well. And it would be this, which DC Comics, I think, added the purple wine-colored shadow there of the Shadow. I don't know if that was needed, but nevertheless, it is the cover of a 1989 hardcover collection that DC put out of all of 5 issues of Kaluta's 1970s DC Shadow. Stories you have just read were originally published some 15 years ago, but the passage of time has not diluted Michael William Kaluta's love for the Shadow. In the following piece, written and illustrated by Kaluta and colored by Elaine Lee, especially for this volume, Kaluta once more adds to the legend of the Shadow with a tale of a kidnapped child and the machinations of the Chinese mastermind known as Wing Fat. So in addition, folks, to getting a collection in hardcover, beautifully designed, of all 5 of Kaluta's 70 issues, we get a brand new penciled and inked and beautifully colored, or better colored than the graphic novel by Marvel. I love the Vertigo-like perspective of this and the great lettering serving as almost fluttering pieces of paper in the air. Just a real beautiful illustration to start off this choice collector's item, Kaluta's return to drawing a Shadow story circa 15 years later. So I'm going to show you the highlights, the artistic highlights of his Shadow in this. I believe it was maybe 12 pages, 15 pages, somewhere around there. And you can see Kaluta is now using color more than ever to define what the Shadow is wearing versus totally smothering it in black ink. And again, the Japanese Asian influence on Kaluta's art is prominent throughout the story, as it takes place, of course, in Chinatown. Look at this top panel on the next page, that beautiful feeling of motion and movement. The beautiful shadows, pun intended. The bottom right, interesting the way he's got the Shadow draping the red scarf over his nose versus under, not what he usually does. The white hair is kind of interesting. Here's an offbeat page combining Interior panels with information in the gutters to give you a real feeling of the shadow's predicament. Nice brushwork. Nice colors by Elaine Lee. And a nice shadow figure to round out that page. Each panel is just beautifully designed by Kaluta, and yet beautifully tells the story, which is what comics are supposed to do. Great shadow figure from behind, nice brush inking, solid blacks, beautiful colors. There's a nice close-up. I would have preferred a little more stylized coloring here from Elaine Lee versus just the flat flesh tone. But there's a real typographic page with the ha 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 shadow laughter cascading through the page. Look at the shadow grasping the child. And then turn the page. You feel that explosion as your eyes take in the entire page. The weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Now, this idea of the shadow rescuing the child, that goes back to the classic manga, Lone Wolf and Cub, that appeared in 1970 and really changed the game for manga, became one of its most famous. And there's the interior art. Between 72 and 74, they made a handful of movies that are considered definitive icons of Lone Wolf and Cub. And then in the 90s, after the Shadow story, they started to reprint the Lone Wolf and Cub mangas with new covers by Frank Miller. So it's interesting that Kaluta would use this motif, maybe his own homage to Lone Wolf and Cub. Nice final panel of the cityscape, the lone figure of the shadow in the left corner there. My thanks to Will Murray and Anthony Tolan for their help in keeping my facts straight. Those are shadow experts that Denny O'Neil thanked. And then Mike Kaluta says to Denny O'Neil for putting up with me. Probably refers to deadlines, I bet. Once again, interesting that they took this shadow figure. Beautiful, huh? Of course, it comes from that one-off Rights and Inked issue that I showed in last week's webinar. So that wraps up the hardcover reprint 1989. Look at the rather garish ad that DC used to advertise the collection. Kind of a little bizarre, but hey, it is a nice item that every shadow lover of Kaluta's you just have to have. It's pretty definitive. So in 1989, the same year that they put out this hardcover collection, they cross-promoted it with their new shadow title. That's not a Kaluta cover. That is by, oh, I just blanked on his name, Steve. I can't believe I forget this guy's name. Great painter, Steve Hickman, maybe. And yes, it was New Tales of the Shadow, but Kaluta only did this beautiful pen and ink sketch for the only cover he did of the Shadow Strikes, which would be an annual that they put out the same year that the title debuted. And then in 1991, we get this beautifully watercolored drawing of the shadow in San Francisco, again with the Chinese motifs in the background. And it was a cover for WonderCon. But there it is, 1991. And then 1993/94, we get this beautiful pen and ink swirling miasmic image, which Kaluta would then paint to look like this. Why? Because the comic book publisher Dark Horse decided to do a 4-issue miniseries that Kaluta would not illustrate the interiors of. He would only do the covers and the frontispiece, as it's called, which looked like this, a beautiful classic pen and ink shadow with a lot of detail on what he's wearing there. Well, it started out as a sketch Kaluta did for Michael Stratford. If you're watching this webinar or you're watching the video of it, Michael, thank you for posting this. It's from 1991. And you can see that Kaluta would basically ink it, and it would be both the promotion piece for the miniseries. See, it says featuring the art of Michael William Kaluta, but that was only the covers and the frontispiece, because the interior was Jerry Gianni, and while he had his own style, very influenced by the pulps, you can see the pen and ink detail on the Shadow's face, and he had a kind of an old-fashioned feel to his work. And while he did a yeoman's job, there was nothing like Kaluta's Shadow. In fact, they did get Kaluta to write and draw text pieces illustrated with spot illustrations of a handful of pages long called My City. And they were little vignettes written by Kaluta with beautiful spot illustrations like this one. There it is in black and white, and then in color. So it would be Kaluta, the book illustrator, with images like this and others that would break out of the rectangular boxes. So here's issue 2, the cover, pencil and inked, and kind of looks like painted watercolor color. There's the black and white original, the best resolution, of course, I could get. And the color. Here's his installment of My City for this issue. Interesting color choice here. I mean, Kaluta really put the work into these covers. I mean, the level of detail, as you can see in black and white, again, the best resolution I could find. And there's the finished color. Here's a nice My City image. I love these alternate views of the Shadow's face and head that Kaluta's been giving us on these great pieces. And the cover to issue 4. Again, just a lot of beautiful line work that you can really see in the black and white version. Best resolution again. And you can see how much color adds, right, to every illustration. And how about this My City? I love Kaluta's type. He just draws such beautiful letters, and they really echo his illustrative style. Even things like the Shadow's gloves, nobody's gotten them better than Kaluta. You know, even Steranko, I think Steranko does him barehanded. He doesn't even bother, but Kaluta gives him the black gloves. And there it is in black and white. And just look at the level of detail in those hands. I mean, that's what makes them beautiful. And how much color adds to the image. Here's an offbeat illustration. But we get the final My City. How about that one, folks? I love when Kaluta curves the buildings and the perspective. How about in black and white? And then there was this piece he did, which was the full color painted version of that frontispiece. Here's a pencil study that Kaluta did for it. That's gorgeous all on its own. And then you have the fully rendered version, which became the cover for the trade paperback collection of all 4 issues. Now, inside the 4th issue, I believe, was a print ad for this, the official movie magazine of the Shadow. What the? Yes. In 1994, they put out a movie version of The Shadow with Alec Baldwin, who had just become somewhat of a star after The Hunt for Red October in 1992, I believe. And if you've seen the movie, I think we can all agree it was a bomb on every level. The visualization of the Shadow's face, I did not like at all. The less said about the film, the better. But the best thing about the film was that Mike Kaluta did a 2-issue film adaptation in comic book form. This piece, the first piece that he did, was a promotion piece for the comic book adaptation print material, which looked like this. These were the posters that went out to comic book stores, I guess. And you can see in a close-up here, they highlight the 2 issues. So it seems like the 93 miniseries that Kaluta only did the covers of was once again setting the stage for the 1994 film adaptation that Kaluta did not just do the covers. Joel Gaw shared a writing credit, but Kaluta penciled and inked the interiors as well. The covers, though, are just more beautifully detailed, filigreed examples of Kaluta's shadow work at its finest. And thankfully, Dark Horse didn't let their type and trade dress intrude too much on Kaluta's beautiful work. But yes, we got to see once again, after X number of years, 89, 94, 5 years, we got Kaluta penciling and inking a shadow interior story. Remember I said we love it when Kaluta gets to curve those buildings, those stylized New York buildings, as only Kaluta brings them to life. So I'm going to give you once again the artistic highlights as I see them of this 2-issue series. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Michael Kaluta once again penciling and inking an entire shadow story. And like I said, who cares about the movie when we could ravish our eyes on artwork like that? Pages like that. Sequences like this. Nice coloring there in the center panel. And just to see Kaluta's beautiful layouts, look at the work in black and white. And how about this sequence that I'm showing you in full as your eyes take it in? The movement, the motion, the storytelling, almost cinematic, which is what great comic book art on paper has the feeling of. When an artist is in command of the story, he's like a movie director taking you through the movie as he sees it in his mind's eye. I'm not crazy about the coloring. I forget who did the coloring for him. It's a little, once again, flat to my eyes. I would have liked more stylized. I don't like all those flesh tones. There's the black and white, though. And that brings us to issue 2 with another Chinese Asian influenced, beautifully rendered cover, beautifully colored too, by Kaluta. And the final cover. A great vista cityscape to bring us into the story. Nice close-up of the shadow's eyes. Interesting inking there by Kaluta. The cat and the shadow in the bottom panel is a treat. I'm showing you this page mostly because I have the black and white line work. You know, spotting blacks, as it's called in the business, apportioning your black ink areas to give the page as a whole a compositional sense of balance. Kaluta, as you can see by this page, is great at that. Once again, the coloring is a little flat, all that flesh tone. I like much more stylized lighting versus everything just with what's called local color. So you buy it for Kaluta's pencils and inks. But yeah, I wish the color had been better in places. But it was worth it just to get Kaluta penciling and inking the shadow again in beautifully designed sequences like this. Yeah, the close-up at the end. But imagine if that had been stylized lighting instead of just solid flesh. Folks, coloring adds a lot to comic art. And another nice pistol page. See, here we're getting a little bit of interesting lighting instead of just flat flesh tones. In black and white, once again, the balance in black and white, the solid blacks that take you through the page. Couple of good close-ups of the shadow. Nice profile at the end there. And that brings us to the end of the 2-issue series. These would be the last interior stories of the shadow that Kaluta would both pencil and ink. Since the publication of these in '94, Kaluta did other images of the shadow like this. A great piece with Margot Lane. It's recently been reproduced as a poster. I'll give you information for that at the end of the webinar. This is dated 1998. There's a nice pencil sketch by Kaluta and the fully rendered color. Now look at this 1999 take on marionettes. Remember marionettes from 1980? 19 years earlier, Kaluta, maybe by commission, I assume, puts out a different take on the same marionettes concept. In '99, he does the cover of this fanzine, Maelstrom, with a nice image of the Rocketeer there with the shadow and the biplane. 99 gives us a nice companion piece with Margot. Here's another Michael Stratford sketchbook piece, 1999 as well. And not only did Kaluta do this for Michael, but he did the cover of the sketchbook featuring Batman as well. I don't know whether this was given to Michael unfinished and Kaluta meant to ink it all, but it's beautiful either way. Speaking of Batman, once again, every couple of years, we get a commissioned Shadow Batman piece. It looks like he started this in 1999 and finished it in 2000, based on the signature down below. Ah, the great Schnozzola. Jimmy Durante as the Shadow, or maybe Barry Manilow. Remember that cover? I think the concert in Central Park with the profile of Manilow. Okay, I digress. In the year 2000, we get this beautiful pen and ink circular panel design, which Kaluta would finish off in color, which would end up being the back cover of a collection of Kaluta's 20th century works, an overview called Echoes, the drawings of Michael William Kaluta. Interesting that they would use this for the cover and the shadow image for the back cover. Maybe it had something to do with licensing the character. But this image would be reproduced in multiple versions. Like, how about this three-dimensional version? I think we're looking at a wall hanging, like a plate, but that gun looks three-dimensional, like it's coming out. And then you get this piece printed on fabric, which looks like it was a promotional piece. I'm not sure. 2003, we're in the 21st century, and Kaluta's drawings and sketches of the Shadow are as beautiful as ever. 2003. Yes, another Batman piece, circa 2004. How about this very lyrical horizontal piece, very line oriented, very Aubrey Beardsley from the golden age of illustration. Yep, 2005. And then somewhere between 2005 and 2017, maybe, I found these random images on the internet. But this was a commission piece, really beautiful environment. I think it was commissioned by the ex-cop, illustrated next to the Shadow there. Then Kaluta does this piece in 2016 that looks like a new version. Remember the piece from 1988/89 used for the DC Comics hardcover? Well, it was used again circa 2016 for the cover of this great interview with Kaluta, John Cook's Comic Book Creator magazine. 2017, we get this image, partially inked. Interesting technique for the shadow there and kind of a red pen. But here's the finished ink drawing. There's Kaluta's signature in the upper right corner, dated 2017. The same year, this double header with the Rocketeer, a commission piece. I'm sure all these were. That's why you get the Shadow teaming up with Will Eisner's The Spirit, drawn for Peter Holson. 2017 was the year that Dark Horse Comics, or Dynamite, excuse me, not Dark Horse, commissioned Kaluta to do, once again, just the covers of a new Shadow series. So how about this illustration that became this cover? Or maybe this is the preliminary ink, and then I don't have the finished cover, but a lot of excitement in that image. Kaluta's colored finish and his black and white original. A lot of beautiful line work once again in those gloves. Kaluta really takes time with the Shadow's gloves. You gotta love it. You gotta glove it. And then there's the great aerial images. Kaluta loves the blimps, the whirligigs, all those chances. Look at Kaluta's original sketch, though, from a whole different perspective. And then he changed it, penciled and inked it, and eventually colored it to look like that. And then how about this cover? I mean, it's beautiful in full color, but when you see it in black and white, you appreciate really the level of Kaluta's artistry. While it's detailed, it's not confusing. The level of detail enhances the subject matter in the foreground, which is where your eye goes. So the detail in the backgrounds do not take away, they just add to the richness of the image. And then of course, color clarifies it more, but yeah, I like the black and white version better of this one. 2018 brings us this commission piece, which started out as this sketch. Kaluta figuring out the shadow character, and eventually the finished penciled, inked, and looks like some wash tone in there. Now, somewhere in this time frame, Kaluta does this. Shadow and Batman team up for Dynamite. I'm not sure whether this was a separate series. I couldn't really find information, but there it is in black and white. And yeah, Kaluta loves all those contraptions. And then you get in the 2020s, you get this beautiful piece in its pencil sketch / drawing. And then the extended piece, partially inked. And it looks like the fully inked version. Wow, a lot of drawing in there, folks. A lot of time in those buildings, the filigreed inking, and then the coloring. Muted tones, really fairly monochromatic. You got the purple against the beige, and then the shadows, strong black and red popping out. How about this Chinese Asian influence piece? Another painting by Kaluta, used for the cover. Remember Maelstrom? It shows you how Kaluta is faithful. He did issue 7's cover in 1999. 23 years later, he returns for the full color cover for their 50th anniversary special. Most recently, Kaluta did this giant mural. It's like, I don't know, 5 or 6 feet tall. And the level of detail is certainly amazing. As your eye tries to take it all in, as I slowly scan the image down, it's a kaleidoscope of the city and Kaluta, the phantasmagoria of the shadows world, as only Mike Kaluta can render it. Really a masterpiece. I think obviously a commission piece. Here it is in an earlier stage in black and white with some blue tone thrown in there to begin to separate the imagery out until you get the final colored image. And there's our hero, Mike Kaluta, hard at work. Like I said, that's about 6 feet tall, maybe. And it's really the most fitting image I could find to end this webinar on the 50th anniversary of the definitive shadow in the eyes of many aficionados, Michael Kaluta's Shadow. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here at this 2-part webinar. If you go online, you should be able, glimmergraphicsprints.net, to find these beautiful prints of the images that I've shown you, as well as maybe others, or go to Facebook and connect with Todd, with 2 Ds, Adams. He's Kaluta's agent, I believe, in getting all these printed and distributed. If you go to my website, you'll see my works as both a comic book style illustrator and historian. My comic book history works are first and foremost led by my book, The Silver Age of Comic Book Art, about comic book art in the 1960s and the great artists that drew the great characters that they're making all the TV shows and movies out of today. It's linked to my book buying site where you can get a signed and sketched in by me hardcover of my book, which will rock your world and change your life. I run a Facebook group on the Silver Age. Friend me and join. One on just Jack Kirby's work and one on the artists who influenced me and a whole generation, I think. Neil Adams influenced my own illustration style the most. My homepage of my website, if you scroll down, you can see all of my best illustrations neatly categorized for your viewing pleasure. And then I'm linked to the commercial site TeePublic, where you can get over 100 of those images at every kind of application, knick-knack, gewgaw, and thingamabob you could think of. So support your local freelance artists, folks. If you go to my visual lectures and webinars page, it's linked to both my YouTube channel and my Vimeo channel. My YouTube channel has most of my comic book history and other pop culture webinar videos, and then the pre-pandemic live lectures. My Vimeo channel has all of the webinars and lectures that had copyrighted material that YouTube's lawyers flag, but I guess Vimeo's don't. So God bless Vimeo. So many of my pop culture webinars on Bruce Springsteen, The Twilight Zone, James Bond, Connery webinars are all on my Vimeo channel. So folks, the same summer of '73 that the Shadow 1 came out, and if you saw last week's webinar, I first saw that cover about a week before it came out on the newsstand at the 1973 New York Comic Art Convention, the famous Phil Seuling conventions, at the Commodore Hotel, which is now the Grand Hyatt next to Grand Central Station. And when I looked in the ballroom, I remember seeing a giant blow up of that shadow cover. But that same convention, I got my first look, like many of us did, at the cover of the leading fanzine of the day that had advanced news. Folks, the Comic Reader was our internet. And it's there we learned in the summer of '73 of changes at DC, and one of them being the appearance of this very unique looking character by an artist I'd never heard of, brand new, Simonson. We found out his name is Walt Simonson. Walt Simonson, 50 years later, is still doing incredible work, but it was his Manhunter work that made his bones and blew our minds. So folks, sometime in August, I believe, because the first Manhunter, I think, went on sale July 31st, a couple weeks after the Shadow #1. So let's just say August of '73, we were all ogling Walt Simonson's Manhunter. So if all goes well, folks, I'll be putting a webinar together on the 50th anniversary of Walt Simonson's Manhunter. So if you go to the events blog page of my website, I always put my comings and goings with all the URL links that you'll need to get there. So thanks again, ladies and gentlemen, for being here at this webinar. I hope to see you on the next one, and take care. Bye-bye. Thanks for attending this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. And please remember to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. And visit my website, arlenschumer.com, to sign up for my newsletter too. Until next time, I'm Arlen Schumer. Bye-bye.